Empire was born in the same place civilization was, Mesopotamia. But it took time. 1,000 years after the dawn of civilization, Sumeria was still a land of small, independent city-states. There were about 36 of them all told, stretching from where the Tigris and Euphrates approach one another most closely, down to the river's mouths at the Persian Gulf. The names of some of these city-states are still remembered today: Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Kish. The reason why Sumeria was so politically fragmented is its geography. The Tigris and Euphrates emptied into the Persian Gulf through a maze of marshy channels that created barriers between the isolated bits of high ground where the cities were located. The marshy geography also kept the city's territory small. A big one might be only 20 miles across. Constitutionally, the city-states were monarchies. Their kings were known as enses. The names and the lengths of their reigns are preserved in a document from around 1900 BC that we call the Sumerian King List. The King List brings it home to us that ancient Mesopotamians didn't think about the past the same way we do. There's no distinction in it between myth and history, and the sense of time and chronological relationships is all distorted to our way of understanding. For example, after the moment when kingship descended from heaven, as the list says, until the Great Flood, which passed from Sumerian myth into the Bible, the kings have reigns that are 20, 30, even 40,000 years long. Even after the flood, when kingship descended from heaven again, monarchs still reign for 300, 400, 900, or even 1,200 years. And the King List sees the kings of the various cities as ruling sequentially, one after another, rather than simultaneously. This produces a very drawn-out chronology. Reality doesn't intrude until much later. The first historical ruler on the King List is Enma-Bara-Gizi, who was king of Kish, and whose existence is proved by his name appearing on a broken pot from around 2700 BC. A couple of generations later, Gilgamesh appears as the 5th king of Uruk. It'd be lovely to know what Gilgamesh did that made him into an epic hero, but whatever it was, once upon a time, he does, in fact, seem to have been an actual flesh and blood king, who spent most of his time, as other kings did, going to war with his neighbors. Because dry land and resources were scarce, warfare was the norm among the closely packed city-states. The major cities were almost always at each other's throats. The King List legends claim that rulers conquered wide swaths of territory. The truth seems to be that any conquests were both local in space and temporary in time. These constant, inconclusive wars finally came to an end around 2350 BC. Lugal-Zagizi, the ruler of Umma, conquered Ur and Uruk, and then finally defeated Uruk-Agina, king of Lagash. This gave Lugal-Zagizi control over the most important centers in lower Mesopotamia. Being a politician, of course, he soaked his achievement for the maximum spin. In addition to giving himself the title, King of Uruk and all the land, he claimed that his conquests reached from the lower sea to the upper sea, that is, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, that he made all the foreign lands subservient to himself, and that thanks to him, there was nothing but peace, prosperity, and happiness throughout his realm. We have no polling data to back up that last claim. But even though Sumeria was now at last unified, centuries of incessant warfare had drained its strength and left it vulnerable to conquest, not only from inside Sumeria, but from outside as well. And since Sumeria had also grown very insular, outside was the one direction that nobody was expecting trouble to come from. Enter onto the stage Sargon of Akkad, founder of the first empire in all of human history. It's only the truth when we call him Sargon the Great. Of course, our sources for his biography are full of problems. Contemporary sources are few and far between. We have one badly damaged inscription, a few year names, and a handful of documents of his family and retainers. Most of what we know about him comes from copies of inscriptions that he set up in Nippur, in the temple of Enlil. Copies were made by scribes around 1800 BC, and by that point, Sargon had become a culture hero, nearly on a par with Gilgamesh. Nevertheless, scholars don't see any particular reason to doubt that the copies the scribes made were accurate. We also have a lot of very colorful literary material. Sargon was the focus of a lot of popular epic poetry down through the first millennium BC. Other stories about him showed up in religious omen texts and chronicles. The romantic stories about his birth and his rise to power set the standard for stories about later culture heroes. Here's the birth legend of Sargon. We'll let Sargon speak for himself. Sargon, the mighty king, king of Akkad am I. My mother was a priestess, my father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is Azuparanu, which lies on the banks of the Euphrates. My mother, the priestess, conceived me. In secret, she gave birth to me. She set me in a basket made of reeds. She sealed its lid with pitch. She cast me into the river, which did not rise up over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Akki, the water drawer. Akki, the water drawer, lifted me out of the river as he drew his ewer. Akki, the water drawer, took me as his son and reared me. Akki, the water drawer, appointed me as his gardener. While I was his gardener, Ishtar gave me her love. And for 56 years, I exercised kingship. Reflecting on the legend, scholars have come to a consensus about Sargon's origins and rise to power. He was an outsider, not part of any Sumerian city dynasty. So we think Sargon was a commoner, even a foundling, like the birth legend says, trained to be a gardener, certainly not born to social and political privilege. His questionable status and legitimacy are also reflected in his name. Sargon was not his actual personal name. His real name is lost, forgotten in the depths of time. Maybe that's the way he wanted it. The name we know him by is the customary form of his throne name, Sharukin, which means the king is legitimate. Now, maybe I lack subtlety, but giving yourself a name like the king is legitimate sounds to me either like wonderful irony or a frank admission that whatever else the king may have been, he was not, in fact, legitimate. But if Sargon was illegitimate, then in what sense was he illegitimate? Was he illegitimate by birth? That's what the birth legend points to. Was he illegitimate as ruler? That's what some of the stories about him suggest. Or was he both? We know that he began his ascent to power in the city of Kish, in the northern part of Sumeria. There, according to the king list, Sargon was cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, the king of Kish. Today, cupbearer sounds very humble, but it was actually an important post, sort of a chamberlain. According to the legends, Sargon had a dream that Ishtar was going to drown Ur-Zababa in a river of blood. Being a good and loyal servant to the king, he related the dream to Ur-Zababa, who then proved himself to be a thankless wretch by trying to have Sargon killed, not once, but several times, failing repeatedly because Ishtar protected Sargon out of her love for him. Frustrated but undeterred, Ur-Zababa then asked Lugal-Zagizi, remember him, to do the job for him, and even had Sargon carry the request to Lugal-Zagizi in person, thinking Sargon would be none the wiser. Perhaps Sargon's suspicions had been aroused by all the close calls he'd been having recently. Or perhaps Ur-Zababa had neglected to lick the seal on the envelope. What's really remarkable is that it had escaped Ur-Zababa's notice that his trusted cupbearer was literate. And so Sargon read his master's assassination request. Sadly, the legend breaks off at this point, so we have no idea how the plot thickened from here on, but it certainly does offer a compelling and early lesson in the importance both of getting an education and reading other people's mail. If we don't know how the plot thickened, we do know how the story turned out. Sargon rebelled against Ur-Zababa and crushed him, making himself master of Kish, and then turned against Lugal-Zagizi. As one of the copied inscriptions says, quote, "He conquered the city of Uruk and destroyed its walls. He challenged the man of Uruk in battle, and in battle took Lugal-Zagizi, the king of Uruk, prisoner. He led him in a wooden collar to the gate of Enlil." End quote. And so began the reign of Sargon of Akkad, a reign which began in 2334 BC and was to last no less than 56 years. There is no doubt about the origins of the Akkadian Empire. The empire was entirely the product of Sargon's genius. He acted swiftly to break with the Sumerian past. Soon after he took the throne from Ur-Zababa and dragged Lugal-Zagizi back to Kish in a yoke, he moved his capital to an entirely new location, outside Sumeria, the city of Akkad. Akkad's as mysterious as Sargon himself. We don't know whether it was an existing city, as some later sources suggest, or whether Sargon founded it from scratch. What we do know is that it lay far north of Sumeria. We haven't identified its location, but it may be underneath modern Baghdad, which sits at the strategic spot where the Tigris and Euphrates come closest together. If Akkad lay in central Mesopotamia, then from it, Sargon could launch his armies in any direction within Mesopotamia or even outside it. The Tigris and Euphrates afford easy access to the south, to Sumeria and the Persian Gulf. And they also provide good routes to the north and west. And the Diyala River Valley provided a well-traveled pathway to the east into the mountains of western Iran. Akkad was not only the political and military nerve center of Sargon's empire, it was the empire's economic hub too. It was the focus of both maritime and overland trade. It served as the transshipping point between trade that came up the Persian Gulf and commerce that came from Anatolia and Syria. According to contemporary texts, ships from Oman, Bahrain, and the Indus River Valley all docked there to transfer their goods to caravans and to take on cargo from inland. We even hear of a resident interpreter in Akkad for the language of the Indus River Valley peoples. In addition to being the focal point for these far-flung commercial networks, Akkad was also the main center of the empire's consumption. Agricultural surpluses were taken to Akkad and stockpiled there. The massive building projects in the capital drew craftsmen from around the empire. Basing himself on Akkad, Sargon launched military campaigns that spanned the entire Fertile Crescent. He started in the south by conquering Sumeria. Once he'd overthrown Ur-Zababa and Lugal-Zagizi, he took Ur, Umma, and no fewer than 50 other towns and cities in lower Mesopotamia. Next, he turned east, subdued the kingdom of Elam in southwestern Iran. Then he marched north up the Diyala Valley and crushed Elam's neighbor, Simuram. His southern and eastern flanks now secure, Sargon led his armies west through the northern Fertile Crescent, where he destroyed the powerful city of Mari on the upper Euphrates. Then he invaded Syria and sacked the wealthy city of Ebla. The epic poems preserve rumors of a campaign into central Anatolia as well to punish local rulers for oppressing Akkadian merchants. Finally, at the pinnacle of his power, Sargon and his victorious troops stood on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, 600 miles from Akkad. For 2 generations, Sargon's heirs defended and expanded on his legacy. As would often be the case in the ancient Near East, rebellions followed the death of a powerful ruler. So for 30 years after Sargon's death in 2278, his sons Ramush and Manishtushu had to fight to keep the empire intact. Opposition was especially bitter in Sumeria, which erupted in revolt as the Ensis tried to regain their independence. Elam joined in the rebellion. But all the rebellions were brutally suppressed. Rimush claims to have deported tens of thousands of defeated rebels for resettlement elsewhere. When he came to the throne in 2255, Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, also had to fight to maintain the empire. Sumeria greeted his accession with another massive uprising. All the major cities of Sumeria, 18 in all, joined the rebel cause. The rebels were grouped into two coalitions, led by Kish in the north and Uruk in the south. They fielded well-organized armies, able to meet imperial troops in open battle. It shows how strong hostility against Akkad was among the ruling classes throughout Sumeria, and how even several decades of Akkadian rule and the suppression of earlier revolts had failed to destroy local patriotism and subdue local authority structures. Naram-Sin acted swiftly and decisively. He crushed the rebel coalition in a year-long campaign, whose highlights were 9 battles, all of which he claims to have won. After crushing the Great Revolt, Naram-Sin next turned against Elam. Again, he showed that he was cast in his grandfather's mold. He smashed the princes of Elam and forced them to surrender. Once he'd crushed the uprisings that greeted his accession, Naram-Sin pushed the frontiers of the Akkadian Empire even farther than Sargon had. He led an expedition all the way down the Persian Gulf, past the Straits of Hormuz, and forced the submission of Magan, the modern territory of Oman. We found stone bowls taken as booty in this expedition, inscribed with the words, "Taken from Magan." Like his grandfather, Naram-Sin also campaigned west into Syria. There he defeated the Amorite nomads of the desert fringe, took the city of Aleppo, and marched as far as the coast of Lebanon. Finally, he led his army into the rugged mountains of eastern Anatolia, to the very sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, where he set up an inscription near Diyarbakir to proclaim his achievement. Sargon and Naram-Sin forged the basic pattern which future Mesopotamian empires would follow. The core feature of that pattern was centralization of authority around the person of the king. They carefully crafted a so-called royal ideology, a kind of Bronze Age propaganda, to indoctrinate their subjects with a particular image of their ruler. The construction of this ideology shows most clearly in the royal titles that Sargon and Naram-Sin used, which drove home the point that they were the lords of a vast realm. So even though he'd moved his royal center to Akkad, Sargon continued to call himself King of Kish, because the name Kish resonated with the word Kishatum, which means the entire inhabited world. Naram-Sin went his grandfather one better. After his successful military campaigns outside Mesopotamia, he began calling himself King of the Four Corners of the Universe, making the point that his authority extended beyond that of any previous monarch, and thus beyond the sphere of mere human beings. Naram-Sin finally declared himself to be a god. You have a seal on which Naram-Sin describes himself as Naram-Sin, the mighty man, god of Akkad, king of the four quarters of the universe. On another inscription, he claimed that inhabitants of Akkad had implored the gods of the cities of Sumeria to grant him divinity, quote, because he succeeded when heavily pressed in maintaining his city and strength. The people of Akkad implored the gods to have him as the god of their city of Akkad, and they built him a temple in the city's midst, end quote. He also proclaimed his divinity on his monuments, like his famous victory stele, by having himself depicted much larger than the rest of humanity, and by wearing a horned helmet, which was a mark of deity in the Near East. No previous Mesopotamian ruler had ever dared to go this far. Previous kings had received divine honors after their deaths, become the focus of cults. But Naram-Sin was the first to demand worship during his own lifetime. Central to royal ideology was the image of the king as victorious warrior. There was, of course, a lot of truth to this. Sargon and Naram-Sin were the greatest conquerors the world had yet seen. They spent more time campaigning than doing anything else. They led Akkadian armies to what seemed like the ends of the earth, and they had conquered what was certainly a great empire. But the royal ideology also emphasized the role of the kings as benefactors of their subjects. The king seized immense amounts of booty in the course of their conquests. Much of it was stockpiled in the royal treasury, but much of it was given away or bestowed on temples. A lot of it was distributed to the troops. In addition to crafting a royal ideology, Sargon used religion to cement the loyalty of his empire. Religion lay at the heart of life in Mesopotamia. It was the central feature of ancient Near Eastern existence. Each city was identified with its chief deity, whose favor and power were reflected in the fortunes of that city. Each city was physically centered on the ziggurat, the temple of its chief deity. Temples controlled significant amounts of land and therefore played sometimes dominant roles in the economic lives of their cities. So Sargon was careful to place people he could trust in key religious positions. He appointed his daughter to be priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. He even gave her a purely Sumerian name, Enheduanna, meaning priestess, fit for heaven. And by doing so, he inaugurated a practice that was continued by every monarch who dominated Mesopotamia for the next 500 years. Trying to control religious cults throughout the entire region, Naram-Sin expanded on Sargon's practice and appointed several of his daughters to priesthoods throughout other cities in Sumeria and Lower Mesopotamia. Sargon tried to create a larger imperial system out of the independent city-states of Mesopotamia and Sumeria. He tried to find a balance between loyalty to the larger imperial entity he'd created and the old local loyalties whose roots ran so deep. For the most part, he left the local ensies in place, but now holding power at his pleasure and thanks to his favor. And it's from this point on that the term ensi takes on the meaning of governor rather than the meaning of king. His hope seems to have been that this would win their loyalty and gratitude. But just in case it didn't, Sargon and Naram-Sin kept members of the ensi's families, the royal court in Akkad, partly to integrate them into the imperial system, but also as political hostages. Of course, in the end, the policy failed, both because local loyalties, interests, and ambitions were far stronger than any sense of obligation to a foreign king, and because loyalty to the king was personal. So when the king died, the bonds of loyalty died with him. This undoubtedly contributed to all the rebellions that plagued Sargon's sons and his grandson. It was in response to this failure that Naram-Sin began the practice of appointing his own relatives and court favorites as ensies in place of the locals. Some of his appointees were even commoners who therefore were entirely dependent on him. The best example is the man he appointed as ensi in Lagash, who prior to his appointment was nothing more than a common scribe at the court. To standardize the administration of his empire, to help break down local loyalties, Sargon made Akkadian the language of imperial administration and record-keeping. This meant that scribes now had to learn a new language. It also meant that Sumerian cuneiform had to be adapted for writing Akkadian, which demanded greater flexibility and accuracy in indicating grammatical forms than Sumerian did. Sargon and Naram-Sin also centralized the recording of time, standardizing the system of year names that was used throughout the empire. To provide the vast revenues that his empire needed, Sargon created a new system of taxation as well. And since the invention of money still lay 1,700 years in the future, taxes were levied in foodstuffs and goods. For the same reason, imperial officials and military personnel were also paid in food and supplies. Sargon ordered that a part of each region's produce and wealth either be siphoned off to the capital city to serve imperial needs, or else be stockpiled locally in imperial warehouses for the use of the Akkadian army and administration. Naram-Sin took his grandfather's centralization a step further and imposed universal accounting standards and systems of weights and measures for use in taxation and imperial bookkeeping. The most enduring change was that the Akkadian gur, about 300 liters, henceforth became the standard unit for measuring barley throughout the Near East. In their territories outside Mesopotamia, Sargon and Naram-Sin took a flexible approach to imperial government. They employed a variety of administrative techniques adapted to local circumstances and requirements. In Elam, while Akkadian became the language of imperial administration, local rulers retained control over local affairs, and local government was conducted in the native language. In northern Mesopotamian Syria, Akkadian control appears to have been more direct. Members of the royal family were set up as governors in important places like Mari. We know that Sargon and Naram-Sin installed customs officials in key towns and posted military garrisons throughout Syria. Diplomacy also played an important role in maintaining imperial control. Naram-Sin married his daughter Taramagade to the prince of Urkesh in northern Syria, and foreign noble women show up as the brides of Akkadian princes. The task of conquering such a vast empire and maintaining internal and external security once it was conquered demanded a powerful military machine. Sargon created a standing army, perhaps the first in all of history. Akkadian sources boast that 5,400 men ate each day in Sargon's presence, which suggests that he raised and provisioned a substantial military force loyal to him alone. He provided this standing army with its arms and equipment, and since money didn't exist yet, the troops were paid with wool and rations and given plots of land for their subsistence. Sargon supplemented this professional army with additional troops from other sources. Communities of the empire were expected to provide local levies for imperial military expeditions. Pastoral peoples on the fringes of the empire, like the Gutians and the Amorites, were tapped for mercenary contingents. Sargon and Naram-Sin also built fortresses to hold the units of the regular army and to secure the empire's territories together. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire was swift, can be traced to a combination of internal and external factors. A fundamental problem was relentless Sumerian hostility. Even after a century of Akkadian rule, the city aristocracy still nurtured dreams of independence. The Sumerians regarded the Akkadians as foreigners. The Akkadians had driven the point home by imposing Akkadian as the language of imperial administration, by imposing uniformity in weights and measures and in the calendar, not to mention by imposing Akkadian princesses on ancient Sumerian cults as their chief priestesses. The repeated rebellions in Sumeria not only demonstrated Sumerian resentment of Akkad, but also inspired Akkadian retaliation, which tended to make relations even worse. Ramush claims to have killed or deported tens of thousands of rebels from the cities of Sumeria. But Naram-Sin aroused special resentment among the subject peoples of the empire. This is reflected in the bitter hostility of later tradition to his memory, a hostility that is particularly religious in its flavor. Sumerian poems portray Naram-Sin as the epitome of the self-willed ruler who scorns the gods, probably arising out of hostility to his arrogation of deity to himself. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian language text, very negatively contrasts Naram-Sin's piety with that of Sargon and portrays Naram-Sin as alienated, both from Enlil, the chief deity of Sumeria, and from Ishtar. Kuthian legend, or Naram-Sin and the Enemy Hordes, depicts Naram-Sin as contemptuous of divination, so that he suffers repeated defeats at the hands of foreign invaders until finally he submits himself to the authority of the gods and humbles himself before Enlil. But in addition to Sumerian hostility, the empire also faced numerous external threats. Mesopotamia's lack of natural defenses has always made it vulnerable to external enemies. To the south and west lay the dry steppes of the Arabian desert fringe, inhabited by nomadic clans of Amorites who served Akkad as mercenaries, but also raided the rich farmlands of the valley. To the east, the Zagros Mountains were under the control of native principalities, which either were not subject to Akkad or whose subjection was weak. The princes of Elam in southwestern Iran chafed at being vassals of Akkad. The state of Marhashi, east of Elam, had always been hostile. The Gutians, the mountain tribe of the north-central Zagros, were raiding the Mesopotamian lowlands. By 2200 BC, had begun to establish settlements there. So when it came, the collapse of the Akkadian Empire happened very swiftly. And after the reign of Naram-Sin's son and successor, Sharkal-Ashari, who ascended the throne after his father's death in 2217 and reigned until 2193, there seems to have been dynastic civil war over the throne that badly weakened the central authority. The city rulers of Sumeria saw their chance and cast off Akkadian rule. Northern Mesopotamia also declared its independence, and intercity warfare reappeared. Finally, the Gutians seized control of the Diyala Valley. By 2190, the area under the control of Dudu, the new king of Akkad, had shrunk back to the vicinity of Akkad itself, and Mesopotamia had gone back to being a region of small, independent city-states. And so the first empire died, but the dream of empire lived on.